I never paid much attention to the Dead Sea Scrolls and whether they were legit or not. They were just another piece of mainstream history, so I never bothered to question them. However, once I read the actual account of how they were discovered, and then all of the subsequent and ongoing drama, I decided to look more closely at this amazing and convoluted story. As an added bonus, when I was researching the history of the scrolls, I learned that NASA also had a part in this show. NASA technology developed to study other worlds provided a key to reading these ancient manuscripts by offering a better tool to see beyond what is visible to the eye. Well, as much as I love to bash the fraud known as NASA, they are not my focus in this video. I mainly want to share information from one of the main skeptics of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a not very popular scholar named Solomon Zeitlin. He wrote many well-reasoned articles against the antiquity of the scrolls. But I will touch on NASA's contribution, but later on in this video. So to begin, let's look at how in 1947, in a cave, untouched for 2,000 years, a Bedouin finds jars filled with ancient scrolls. And by the way, Bedouins are nomadic Arabs who have historically inhabited desert regions. So the story goes, and it's very simple, a shepherd of the Ta'amira tribe left his flock of sheep to search for a stray. In the cliffs around the Dead Sea, he apparently found a cave on the hillside and was intrigued, so he threw rocks into it, and then he was startled by the sound of breaking pots. So just so we're clear, the way that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered is that in the area of the Dead Sea, a Bedouin sheep herder goes looking for his lost sheep, finds a cave, throws rocks at it, and then hears pots break. He goes into the cave, finds some pots, and then the 2,000-year-old Hebrew and Aramaic scrolls, supposedly the oldest written record of the Bible. That's amazing. He should have been rich and famous, but he wasn't. In fact, he and his buddies kind of vanished, at least their identity was never properly vetted, and we'll see this later on. Well, first, I think we can agree that there have been many historical hoaxes, admitted to even by the mainstream. One of the most famous is the Piltdown Man, which was hailed as the missing link for evolution, but it turned out to be none other than one of the curators of the Natural History Museum who was responsible for the fraud. They should just rename natural history museums as magical history museums. I mean, it's tough to rely on anything you find in a museum. And there's so many confirmed historical hoaxes out there, it's hard to keep up. We have forged and faked documents, maps, encyclopedias with invented content. Even the history of the bathtub was once the subject of a hoax. There are fake fairy photos, the infamous Ponzi scheme, and here's a good one. In World War II, the director of the Canadian Information and Propaganda Department put together this clip after noticing that Hitler raised his leg rather high while stepping backwards. He realized that it could be looped to create the appearance of Hitler jumping with joy at the surrender of the French. Obviously, it was used to spark outrage, or if you're a millennial, you might say it was used to trigger the Canadian people and demonize the Germans in the orchestrated and fraud-filled Second World War. The victims being the civilian populations, both in loss of lives and loss of freedoms. And real quick, before I get too far off track, we all know about the War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938, the one that caused panic in the U.S. because people thought it was real. But did you know that in 1926 the BBC radio had similarly interrupted a broadcast with a fake emergency announcement about civil unrest and that the Savoy Hotel had been blown up? And the crazy reports continued with news that the Houses of Parliament were being attacked. And this, of course, caused widespread panic, just like the War of the Worlds broadcast. Then in 1947, the Armed Forces radio station in Tokyo interrupted its broadcast with hoax emergency news of a 20-foot sea monster, again causing widespread panic. So successful, I guess, that they decided to make Godzilla movies from this. And maybe these were dry runs, as they saw how easily they could control the masses through fear. So they created the nightly news, so they could tell you how to view the world and what to buy. And then 24-hour news, and now we have the internet in every facet of our lives, all day, every day. It truly is a Matrix circus show where they invent reality for the domesticated slaves. Back to the Dead Sea Scrolls industry, as I call it. Like most hoaxes, this involves hundreds of millions of dollars. There's drama everywhere, crazy interpretations of the contents and historical extrapolations, based on allegedly discovered commentaries on scriptures. We have disputed ownership of the scrolls, fantastic stories, all brought to us by the reputable mainstream and the so-called scientific communities, universities, and governments. It's also funny that the Rockefeller Museum in Israel was conveniently established 10 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. How very interesting. And another strange thing is that more scrolls were found very recently, the post-2002 scrolls, but now they are considered to be fakes. They determined that the post-2002 scrolls from the same area were fake because they somehow didn't properly match up with the 1947 through 56 manuscripts. But what's funny is that no one ever bothers to question the authenticity of the original batch. You see what they are doing here? This is the classic red herring distraction where subsequent releases of obvious fakes divert people's attention away from questioning the authenticity of the original Dead Sea Scrolls, thereby magically and automatically legitimizing the original discovery without any verification or investigation. Or maybe it's just a huge mess of incompetence, greed, and ignorance. Something to think about, at least. So, the main piece I want to present in this video is from one of the few detractors of the mainstream story, Mr. Solomon Zeitlin. He was a Jewish historian, Talmudic scholar, and by some accounts the world's leading authority on the Second Commonwealth at that time. My impression of him, and admittedly this is only from reading small sections of his works, especially not the entire 3-volume set of his best work, The Rise and Fall of the Judean State. My impression of him is that he was a non-conforming academic, and not a wimp intellectually. He seems to be an outsider and mainly ignored in the whole Dead Sea Scrolls mainstream history, or show as you might say. But then again, I'm not a historian, it just makes you wonder. So let's see what the man had to say about the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were discovered, or at least announced to the public, and I'll just read a few sections so as to not bore you to death. So in the 1954 article titled The Antiquity of the Hebrew Scrolls and the Piltdown Hoax, a Parallel, Solomon writes, starting on the second paragraph here, in 1947, news was heralded to the world of the discovery of ancient Hebrew scrolls. They were brought to the Archbishop of Jerusalem, who said that he instantly recognized their antiquity, especially because no people had been living near the shores of the Dead Sea since the destruction of the Temple. A person connected with the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem said that the scrolls were of great value, but nevertheless admitted that though the script was obviously Hebrew, it looked strange to my inexperienced eyes. Photographs were sent to one of our great American archaeologists, who immediately declared that on the basis of paleography, they were of great antiquity, and he said that they would revolutionize biblical scholarship. In this assertion, he did not take orthography into consideration. He made it despite the fact that he had not examined the scrolls in their entirety. The same scholars who originally proclaimed them to be of great antiquity, disregarding all the evidence to the contrary, still maintain this view. Numerous articles and books have been written on the scrolls seeking to establish similarity between their contents and ideas which prevailed among the ancient sects and groups. No one has ventured to combat the evidence which clearly demonstrates that they are of the Middle Ages. Moving on, we have the identity of the Bedouin responsible for the discovery of the scrolls has not been revealed to us. He must have been a religious man, otherwise he would not have been an instrument of providence in discovering the treasure. Dr. Cross, however, in an article entitled The Manuscripts of the Dead Sea Cave, published in the February 1954 issue of The Biblical Archaeologist, at last reveals the name of the Bedouin, Muhammad Dib, a shepherd of the Ta'amira tribe, who discovered the manuscript while seeking a lost sheep. This indeed was providential. This latest disclosure of the identity of the shepherd is too startling to be acceptable. Harding, in his article published in the Palestine Exploration Quarterly, July-October 1949, said that at the time of writing his article, the goat herd had not yet been located. In a note he stated, "Since writing this, Mr. Said, Secretary of the Palestinian Museum, has had an interview with the goat herd." So, for more than 2 years after the so-called discovery, the name of the goat herd was unknown. In the Biblical Archaeologist of May 1949, Mr. Samuel, the Archbishop of Jerusalem, said that on the third Saturday of Tammuz, 2 Bedouin came with a Bethlehem merchant, bringing the scrolls to him, and that he asked them about the 3rd Bedouin and the other scrolls. The answer was that this Bedouin took the other scrolls to the Muslim sheikh. We must assume that when the Bedouin came to the archbishop, he asked them their names. He would have done this as a matter of course. He felt that the scrolls were of very great importance, and urged the Syrian merchant to try to again get in touch with the Bedouin and obtain the scrolls. It would be naive to assume that he would not be interested in learning the identity of the Bedouin. Yet, why has he not revealed the names of these fortunate discoverers of the great treasure, the biblical books that would revolutionize our entire knowledge of biblical history? Mr. Kiraz says that he owns a half share of the scrolls. He must have known who the Bedouin were who supposedly discovered the scrolls. An Oriental merchant would know the identity of the Bedouin with whom he was dealing. And then there's more dispute about the names and ownership, and in the last paragraph we have, my criticism of Dr. Cross is not especially on his identification of the Bedouin. This is only incidental. I criticize him for accepting at face value the word of any Bedouin or Oriental merchant. He repeats the same assertions which have appeared many times in the same magazine, namely, that the scrolls are older by more than a millennium than any other Hebrew text. Repetition does not make a statement a fact. He should have tried to prove his statement. So this guy's good. He sounds like a truth seeker back then. So, moving on, among the scrolls there was an alleged letter from Bar Kokhba. Solomon writes, how could a letter be discovered bearing the name from Simon ben Kozba? In the year 132 CE, a man named Simon led a revolt in Judea against the Romans. The Jews were victorious the first year under his leadership. His followers, particularly Rabbi Akiba, named him Bar Kokhba, i.e. King Messiah. The revolt, however, was crushed by the Romans, and the epithet Bar Kozba, the deceiver, was then given to him. It seems then that the discovery of the so-called Bar Kokhba letter can be classified as another Piltdown hoax, because obviously the timing doesn't match up. He goes on to compare it to the Piltdown skull that was found, that hoax, and he says, the disturbing fact is not that the scholars made an error and were deceived into accepting the antiquity of the scrolls. This is not the first time. To mention a few instances, they were deceived by Firkowich, who fabricated some documents which they accepted at face value. They were also deceived by the forgeries of Shapira. All the archaeologists and the authorities of the British Museum accepted these forgeries as authentic. Scholars were also deceived into accepting the Slavonic Josephus as a translation of the Aramaic draft or of the Greek draft which Josephus wrote. For a time, I stood alone in my effort to expose this last fallacy. My view has since been accepted. The disturbing fact is that the scholars published the so-called Bar Kokhba letter in scientific publications without even raising a question as to why the letter begins with the prefix from and bears a signature at the end. In conclusion, let me reemphasize that instead of advancing wild hypotheses and employing emendations to the text, the scholars should attempt to refute the arguments in my article, The Recent Discoveries Near the Dead Sea, that the Isaiah scroll, the Habakkuk commentary, and the so-called Zadokite fragments are of a late period. They should also clear up the mystery of the letter written by Dr. Trevor to Mr. Hamilton, and discover and reveal the identity of Phineas, who presented the Torah scroll to the late Archbishop of Jerusalem in the year 1929, and locate the whereabouts of the scroll of Haftarot. All of these problems should be solved. To employ theological interpretations and inject mystical meanings into writings composed by obscure Jews smacks of medievalism. Moreover, in doing so, often faulty scholarship is displayed. Brownlee's latest discovery is that the reading of the word in the Isaiah scrolls, 52:14, and so he goes on here with more linguistics arguments. And this is interesting. He writes, I wish to reiterate that I am not especially interested in when the manuscripts were written. Whether they were composed in the 4th, 7th, 13th, or even 20th century is of little importance to me. They were composed by scribes of mediocre ability, and they have no value for the history of the Jewish people and mark no step in the development of ideas, whether Jewish or Christian. My purpose is to show that those who maintain that these scrolls were written during the Second Commonwealth or during the first century of the Christian era are mistaken. As a student of history of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, and engaged in writing the history of the Jews and Judaism of that period, I deemed it necessary to expose the fallacy of the antiquity of the scrolls. So that's some powerful writing, and like I said, he is very thorough and he's very knowledgeable. This guy knows his stuff, so I encourage anybody who's interested to read these articles. And also, moving on, we have the 1953, the fiction of the recent discoveries near the Dead Sea, and a couple of passages that are of interest in this article are: those who believe in the authenticity and the antiquity of the scrolls are inclined to ignore proof to the contrary. Scholarship must take all known facts into consideration to ascertain the truth. It must be objective and impartial. Some writers have not even mentioned that the antiquity of the scrolls has been questioned, like the author of the article The Cave Scrolls and the Jewish Sects, published in the Commentary of July 1953. The author on page 78 says, "Every newspaper reader knows that the discovery at Khirbet Qumran was one of the most important finds of ancient documents ever made. Not a word is said about the fact that many scholars question the antiquity of the scrolls. When one writes for laymen, one should be particularly scrupulous in writing all the facts, as they are not versed in scholarly subjects. Even the editor of the magazine did not append a note stating that there were diverse opinions in regard to the authenticity and the antiquity of the scrolls." That's some good stuff. And further in this article he writes, "To sum up, the assertion that all handbooks on the Bible, early Christianity, and the history of Judaism will soon be in need of drastic revision is groundless. No letters of Bar Kokhba have been discovered. The phylactery which was discovered in the cave was not worn by one of the Essens, but belonged to a Babylonian or Egyptian Jew, and was smuggled out of a Genisa and placed in the cave. The value of the more recent discoveries is of no more importance than the discoveries of 1947. To ascribe the Isaiah scroll, the commentary on Habakkuk, and the so-called Manual of Discipline to the pre-Christian period is to cause confusion in the history of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, which may lead to falsification of the intertestamental literature. No answers have ever been made to my queries. Number 1. From where did the 3 scrolls come which were in a suitcase in the St. Mark's Convent for about 20 years, according to a letter from Dr. Trevor to Mr. Hamilton? Have these scrolls any connection with the discoveries of scrolls in 1947, or with the scrolls which were looted from the synagogues in Hebron in 1929, about 20 years previous? Number 2. Who was the Jew Phinehas who presented a Torah scroll to the late Archbishop in the year 1929, when the great riots took place in Hebron, when scores of Jews were killed, synagogues ransacked, and the Torah scrolls looted? Is the Torah scroll which the Archbishop brought to the United States for sale the same which the Jew Phinehas presented to the late Archbishop, or is it the scroll which Dr. Brownlee and Dr. Trevor saw in the Syrian library, which they say was a manuscript of the 18th century, Ashkenazic, with characteristic German paleography? Number 3. Where is the scroll of the Haftarah which Mr. T. Weschler saw and which has since disappeared? I believe answers to these queries and others which I have put forth will help to shed light on the mystery of the discoveries in 1947. So those are some powerful assertions right there that apparently never were cleared up. This guy could have been a truth seeker. It sounds like a lot of his questions were never answered, sort of like a lot of the questions we are asking today about NASA and space claims. And that was just some of his reasoning. He also focuses on linguistics or paleolinguistics, which I think is fascinating. And so on that note, let's look at the timeline and what has transpired since the scrolls were discovered. I'll just read a few of the highlights of this timeline, but I'll put the link in the description in case you're interested in reading the entire timeline. So, in 1947, Bedouin shepherd finds 7 scrolls in jars in cave above Khirbet Qumran. British barricade Jewish settlements in Jerusalem to contain incidents of violence. And in 1948, American archaeologist William Albright confirms Trevor's identification of Isaiah scrolls as the oldest known Hebrew manuscript. Archbishop Samuel gives Assur director Milar Burrows rights to publicize scrolls and take scrolls to Beirut as violence between Arabs and Jews increases. Burrows issues press release announcing the discovery of the scrolls. British leave Palestine, Jews establish State of Israel, and repel Arab attacks. Trevor describes the discovery of the scrolls in Biblical Archaeologist 11. Professor Sukenik publishes portions of his scrolls, identifying the authors as Essenes. G.L. Harding, British Director of Antiquities for Jordan, launches search for scroll caves with aid of Jordan's Arab Legion. A bunch of academics confirming other academics' work. Yeah, this is peer review working as it was designed to. In 1954, we have Sukenik's son, Yigal Yadin, in the U.S., arranges covert purchase of Archbishop Samuel's 4 scrolls for $250,000. Wow. In 1955, Yadin returns to Israel, reuniting the 7 original scrolls. 56, DeVoe and Harding issue statement to French Academy dismissing the Copper Scrolls' buried treasure as a fiction, incompatible with Essene communal economy. Well, that's interesting. Allegro retracts claims and admits they were based on his interpretations rather than on text. More drama, more crazy theories. Let's go to 1960. Death of Archaeological Museum's patron John D. Rockefeller ends main source of funding for work on scrolls. The transcription of K4 scrolls completed, workshop dismantled, and scrolls locked in safe. Photos of 574 texts divided among remaining scholars. Well, of course the Rockefellers stopped their funding because they start releasing everything as all the work's been done. Speculation, I know. 1965, British scholar Driver publishes the Judean Scrolls, The Problem and a Solution, challenging the accuracy of DeVoe and Dupont-Sommer's interpretation of archaeological and paleographic evidence in dating the scrolls and supporting Roth's hypothesis of the first century Common Era zealot origins of the scrolls. So wow, we have more academics arguing to make it seem like there is authentic debate, but all still blindly accepting the validity of the discovery without considering the opinions of detractors. Totally unscientific, in my opinion. You can read through this. We have 1976. Milik publishes long-awaited Hebrew fragments of Book of Enoch, claiming that the absence at Qumran of any text comparable to the parable section of the Ethiopic version proved that the Son of Man passages in the Ethiopic text were later Christian insertions. So, 1977, we have biblical archaeologist editor David Noel Friedman questions the ethics of a small group of scholars having exclusive rights to study and publish the scrolls at their own discretion. So, hear, hear. 1979, Allegro publishes the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth, claiming that the Gospels were narrative fictions about a non-existent hero, Jesus, based on the teacher of righteousness. Like I said, many crazy extrapolations and division caused by the possible hoax known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in 1986, we have a German scholar argues that O'Callahan's identification of 7Q5 as a fragment of Mark requires complete revision of many modern assumptions about the composition of the Gospels. 1989, Oxford mediates $350,000 grant to expedite publication of the scrolls. So you see, these scrolls are big business in the academic world. Herschel Shanks, editor of Biblical Archaeological Review, calls for publication of timetable for release of the scrolls and characterizes Strugnell's response as a hoax or fraud. So in 1989, they're still trying to get all these things published, and there's just infighting. 1990, still access to the scrolls is reserved to a select few. 1991, Israeli Department of Antiquities announces that it will grant access to official photos of the scrolls to scholars who agree not to publish their findings. Oh boy. 1992, Barbara Thiering, University of Sydney, interprets the scrolls as a product of rivalry between the supporters of John the Baptizer, the teacher of righteousness, and Jesus, the man of the lie. So that's some crazy stuff. 1993, Product Judaica Foundation opens Scrolls from the Dead Sea exhibit at the Library of Congress. 1995, Israeli archaeologist Hanan Eshel announces discovery of 4 sealed man-made caves near Cave 4. 2004, after 10 years of excavation, Majan and Peleg conclude that the settlement at Qumran could not have been a monastery, but rather was a pottery factory which was vacated by its few inhabitants during the Jewish-Roman War, and that refugees from Jerusalem deposited the scrolls, possibly from the temple library, in nearby caves. 2005, Eshel announces that he has obtained new scroll fragments, raising scholars' hopes that there may still be more to discover. Eshel arrested for engaging in the illegal trade of antiquities, but is released without charges being filed. Eshel's scroll fragments confiscated by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, sparking new controversy between scholars and the Israeli government. And as mentioned before, the post-2002 scrolls are considered fakes anyways. It's just a complete mess. What a clown show. Really, if you read through this thing, it's a clown show. And again, there was never any objective, unbiased investigation as to the authenticity of the scrolls. And last but not least, let's look at NASA's contribution to this Dead Sea Scrolls industry. I like this, and this is straight from the NASA website. Seeing into the past, the description of the discovery reads like the opening scene of a big screen adventure. Well, you got that right, NASA. The year is 1947. In the barren hills surrounding the Dead Sea, a shepherd searching for his lost goat stumbles upon a discovery that echoes across time. In a cave, untouched for 2,000 years, he finds jars filled with ancient scrolls. Well, that's just magical. So you can see the image at the left, and this isn't the plot for another Indiana Jones movie. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Oh, wow. So the funny thing is they use their digital infrared imaging, and it allows them to look at the scrolls in a narrow wavelength band, says Gregory Bierman, research scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. In some cases, this reveals detail that a film-based camera looking at a broader wavelength spectrum cannot see. Behrman was invited to Jerusalem to examine the scroll known as the Genesis Apocryphon. By using a multispectral camera outfitted with a liquid crystal filter designed to rapidly change wavelengths, never before seen text in the scroll became visible. Digital images were then fed into a computer with image processing software to further sharpen the photographs. The result? 20 centuries of the past were brought into crystal clarity. Wow. So it's funny, you can see the image to the right here. It's the only one I found that they worked on, where it's practically black at the top and then it reveals it at the bottom. So, here's a product of NASA. You can take that for what it's worth. And then at the end it reads, so while high-tech tools are used to discern the text written ages ago on these ancient scrolls, their meaning and significance will no doubt continue to be debated among scholars and theologians of two faiths who share common roots reconfirmed by the scrolls. So it's more chaos, these scrolls. These scrolls seem to have caused a lot of debate and chaos. So I'm not sure what that's about. And that was very interesting, and I think I'll end it here, but I'm not making any grandiose claims or specific accusations. Anyone who is interested can research the scrolls and the theories derived from the scrolls, and they can decide for themselves what they want to believe. I personally think it's a murky mess of unscientific and extraordinary events. But then again, that's what you get in the Matrix. So, thanks so much for watching, guys, and take care. Adios.